The blizzard came without mercy, a screaming white devil that clawed at the mountainside and devoured the world. Inside his solitary cabin, Cole felt the fury of the wind as a physical blow against the logs, a familiar echo of the storm that had lived inside him for 5 long years. He was a man carved from granite and grief, his heart a frozen stone in his chest since the day he'd buried his wife and daughter. The fire that took them had burned away everything soft within him, leaving only the hard, cold shell of a man who asked for nothing and offered less. He was stoking the fire, the orange light dancing across the haunted plains of his face, when a frantic pounding on his door cut through the howl of the wind. It was a sound he hadn't heard in years, a sound of the living world intruding upon his tomb. He ignored it. Let the storm take them. The world was full of suffering, his cabin was full of ghosts. He had no room for more. The pounding came again, weaker this time, followed by a woman's desperate cry, thin and sharp as a shard of ice. "Please! Please, help us!" Cole's hand tightened on the iron poker. Every instinct screamed at him to stay put, to let the wilderness claim what it would. But the cry had been followed by the faint, hacking cough of a child, a sound that bypassed the fortress around his heart and struck at the hollow place where his own daughter's laughter used to be. A curse tore from his lips, raw and ragged. He threw the poker down with a clang, strode to the door, and wrenched it open. The wind roared in, a blast of Arctic cold carrying a flurry of snow and 2 figures who collapsed onto his floorboards. A woman, her face blue with cold and etched with terror, and a small boy bundled in rags, his breathing shallow and fast. Her eyes, wide and pleading, found his. Her voice was a ragged whisper, a prayer offered to a forgotten god. "Please, sir. My boy." His burning with fever, Cole stared down at them, the storm outside warring with the one inside. He was no savior. He was the wreckage left after the wreck. Yet, he could not leave a child to die on his doorstep. The ghost of his own little girl wouldn't allow it. With a groan that seemed to come from the center of the earth, he slammed the door shut against the howling void, plunging the room into the tense, flickering silence of the firelight. He had just let the world in, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the blizzard, that it would demand a price he was no longer willing to pay. The woman, whose name he learned was Ilara, watched him with the eyes of a cornered animal. She had stripped the wet, frozen rags from her son, Leo, and wrapped him in one of Cole's own coarse blankets, placing him as close to the hearth as she dared. The boy's skin was pale and slick with sweat, his small chest rattling with every breath. Cole moved with a grim, detached efficiency, his hands, once used to the cold steel of a peacemaker, now surprisingly gentle as he checked the boy's fever. It was high. Dangerously so. He said nothing, simply fetched a basin of snow from the porch and began melting it to make a cool compress. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the child's labored breathing. Ilara finally broke it, her voice trembling but resolute. She had seen the hard emptiness in his eyes, the way he moved like a man already dead, and she knew she had nothing to offer him but the raw, brutal truth of her desperation. "There is a man," she began, her gaze fixed on her son. "Judge Thorne. He owns the town, the bank, everything. He owned my husband." Cole didn't look at her, his focus entirely on dampening a cloth. "And now he owns you," he grunted, the words tasting like ash. A tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "He says so. A debt my husband supposedly left. We have nothing. He took our farm, our horse. Everything. We were trying to make it to the next territory when the storm hit." She paused, gathering the last of her courage, the last of her pride. She looked at Cole, at his broad shoulders and the raw power called in his stillness. He was a dangerous man, she could see that. But in the wild, only the dangerous survived. "I have nothing to pay you for your kindness," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, laden with shame and a mother's fierce will to survive. "But I will not see my son die. I will. I will warm your bed, Cowboy. I will do whatever you ask. My child needs a father, even if just for a few nights of safety." The words hung in the air, stark and horrifying. Cole froze, the wet cloth dripping onto the floor. It wasn't the offer that stunned him into silence, it was the abyss of despair from which it had been clawed. He saw his own wife's face in her desperation, the same fierce love that would do anything, sacrifice anything, for her child. The pain was so sharp, so sudden, it was like a physical stab wound. He turned to face her, and for the first time, she saw something flicker in the depths of his grey eyes. Not pity. Not lust. It was rage. A pure, cold rage that was terrifying in its intensity. Never, he snarled, the word a promise and a command. You will never say that again in this house. He turned his back on her, his entire body rigid. Your boy needs medicine, not a mother selling herself. And he doesn't need a father. Especially not me. He snatched his coat from its peg. Stay here. Bar the door. Don't open it for anyone. He didn't wait for a reply, just plunged back out into the raging storm, leaving Elara clutching her son, more afraid of the tormented man who had just saved them than of the blizzard that still sought to claim them. The journey to Redemption Gulch was a battle against a frozen hell, but Cole moved through it like a vengeful spirit, his face numb, his purpose a hot coal in his gut. The town was a collection of grey, weathered buildings huddled under the oppressive shadow of the mountains, all of it belonging, in one way or another, to Judge Thorne. Cole went straight to the doctor's office. Doc Miller was an old man with fear-haunted eyes and hands that trembled slightly, not from age, but from the constant, low-grade terror of living under Thorne's thumb. He gave Cole the medicine for the boy, but his eyes pleaded with him. You're playing with fire, Cole. The woman and her boy. Thorne was looking for them. He posted a bounty. Cole's eyes were chips of ice. He can come collect it, he said, his voice flat and final. He turned to leave, but the doctor's next words stopped him. Her husband, Elias, his death wasn't an accident. He fell from a ridge, they said. But Elias was a careful man. He told me, just days before, that he'd found proof Thorne was cheating the whole valley, cooking the books on land deeds and water rights. He said he was going to expose him. The unspoken truth hung in the air between them. Judge Thorne was not just a cheat, he was a murderer. Cole's jaw tightened. This was no longer about a simple debt. This was about the rot that had consumed an entire town. He returned to the cabin as dawn was breaking, the blizzard finally exhausted. He found Elara asleep in a chair by the fire, her hand resting on Leo's forehead. The boy's breathing was easier, the medicine already working its slow magic. A fragile peace had settled over the room, a peace Cole knew was about to be shattered. He had barely bolted the door when he heard the sound of approaching horses. He peered through a crack in the shutters. It was Judge Thorne, flanked by 2 hired guns, their faces as hard and unforgiving as the landscape. Thorne dismounted, his expensive coat a slash of black against the snow. He smiled, a thin, predatory curve of his lips that didn't reach his cold, dead eyes. It was a smile that preceded terrible things. Cole, he called out, his voice smooth as oiled leather, yet carrying an unmistakable edge of command. A little bird told me you found something of mine. I've come to collect my property. Cole stepped out onto the porch, closing the cabin door firmly behind him. He stood with his arms crossed, a silent, unmovable mountain of a man, positioning himself squarely between Thorne and the life he was protecting inside. The air crackled with a tension colder than the morning frost. Thorne's smile widened, a mask of civility that fooled no one. Now, Cole, he began, his tone patronizing, let's not be difficult. You're a reasonable man. I have a legal claim to that woman and her child. Indentured servants, bound by the debt of her deceased husband. It's all on paper, signed and sealed. He gestured to one of his men, who produced a folded document. The law is the law. Cole's eyes narrowed. He remembered what Doc Miller had said. He saw the lie in Thorne's perfectly pleasant expression. Your law, Cole said, his voice a low rumble, doesn't reach this mountain. Thorne, the judge's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes flashing with irritation. I am the law in this valley. And I am telling you to step aside. That woman is a thief, her son a burden on my accounts. They belong to me until her debt is paid. He paused, letting the threat hang in the air. Or perhaps you'd like to pay it for her? The sum is considerable. $500. It was an impossible amount, a king's ransom. It was a death sentence disguised as a debt. She owes you nothing, Cole stated, the words flat and absolute. Inside the cabin, Ilara listened, her heart hammering against her ribs. She held Leo close, the boy now awake but weak, his wide eyes full of fear. She had heard that voice before, that smooth, chilling tone from the man who had ruined her life. But she had never heard anyone defy him. The sound of Cole's voice, steady and fearless, was a shield she hadn't known she needed. Thorne let out a short, sharp laugh, like the bark of a coyote. Brave words from a man who hides from the world. What is she to you, Cole? Has she warmed your bed already to earn such loyalty? The insult was a physical thing, and Cole felt a tremor of pure, white-hot fury surge through him. The ghosts of his past screamed in his ears. He had failed to protect his family once. He would not fail again. Get off my land, Cole said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. For the first time, Thorne looked at Cole and saw not a hermit, but something else. Something from a past he'd only heard whispers of. A former lawman, they said. A man who had left a trail of dead outlaws from Texas to Montana before his world had burned down. Thorne's bravado hardened into something uglier. Wrong choice, he hissed, the mask of civility gone completely. You will regret this. He remounted his horse, his face a thundercloud of rage. You have 1 hour to hand them over. Or we'll burn you out. Thorne and his men didn't leave. They retreated to the edge of the clearing, just beyond rifle range, their dark shapes a constant, menacing promise against the pristine snow. A siege had begun. Cole went back inside, his movements economical and grim. He bolted the door, checked the loads in his Winchester and his Colt, and placed them within easy reach. He looked at Ilara, whose face was a pale mask of terror. He'll do it, she whispered, her voice cracking. He'll burn us alive. Cole looked at the fire in the hearth, and for a moment, the memory of another fire, of screams he could never hear, threatened to paralyze him. He shook it off, forcing the past back into its cage. He'll try, Cole corrected her, his voice grim. He needed more than just guns. He needed proof. He needed the truth that Doc Miller had hinted at. He turned to Ilara, his gaze intense. The doctor told me your husband suspected Thorne of being a cheat. That he had proof. Ilara's eyes widened. She had been so consumed by grief and fear that the memory had been buried. Now, it surfaced with painful clarity. Yes, she breathed. Elias. He was always so meticulous. He kept 2 sets of books for our farm. One for taxes, one for us. He said you can't trust a man who only shows you one ledger. A few weeks before he fell, he came home late. He was pale, but his eyes were blazing. He said, I've got him, Ilara. I've got the devil himself. She pressed her knuckles to her lips, her mind racing. He said Thorne was a fool. He'd hidden a second ledger, a record of all his real dealings, his thefts, the fraudulent debts. Elias found it. He made a copy of a key page. Cole's heart began to pound with a slow, heavy beat. Where is it? The page? The proof? Ilara's face fell. I don't know. He never told me. He said it was safer if I didn't know. It must have died with him. A profound hopelessness settled over the room. They had the truth, but no way to wield it. Outside, one of Thorne's men yelled, his voice carrying on the cold, still air. 45 minutes, hermit. Your time is running out. Leo began to cry, a thin, weak sound that tore at Ilara's soul. She pulled him closer, humming a lullaby, her own fear a stark counterpoint to the gentle tune. Cole watched them, and the sight of the mother comforting her child in the shadow of death was the final thing that broke the dam inside him. This was his chance. Not just to save them, but to reclaim a piece of the man he had been. To give his own ghost some measure of peace. The minutes ticked by, each one a hammer blow against the fragile silence in the cabin. The firewood was running low, and the chill was beginning to creep back into the room. Leo had fallen into a fitful sleep, his small face still flushed with fever. Elara sat like a statue, her eyes fixed on the door as if she could hold back the evil on the other side through sheer force of will. Cole stood by the window, a sentinel watching the patient predators in the snow. He could see them clearly now. Thorne sat on his horse, imperious and certain, while his two thugs huddled near a small, smokeless fire they'd built, their rifles across their laps. They were waiting. The sun climbed higher, glinting off the snow with a brilliance that felt like a mockery of the darkness they faced. Cole's mind raced through a dozen desperate scenarios. He could try to make a run for it out the back, using the trees for cover, but with a sick child and a woman unused to the harsh wilderness, they wouldn't get 100 yards before Thorne's men ran them down. He could fight. He was one man against three, but his cabin offered good cover. He might take one, maybe even two of them with him, but the outcome was grimly certain. They would be overwhelmed. Thorne would get what he came for, over their dead bodies. Then there was the last option, the one that crawled like a snake in his gut. He could open the door, push Elara and Leo out into the snow, and surrender them to their fate. He would live. The cabin would stand. But his soul, what little was left of it, would be utterly and irrevocably damned. He would be worse than the man who hid from the world, he would be the man who fed the wolves to save his own skin. He looked over at Elara and Leo, a fragile, temporary family huddled in the warmth of his hearth. For 5 years, he had been a ghost haunting his own life. These two people, through nothing more than their own desperate survival, had made him feel alive again. The choice before him was not about living or dying. It was about what kind of man he would be in the moments that remained to him. Would he die a coward, or would he die defending the innocent? What would you do in that moment? When your past offers no comfort and your future seems to offer only a grave. When justice is on your side, but the power, the guns, and the law are all in the hands of a monster. Tell me what you would choose in the comments below. And make sure you subscribe to Wild West Stories, because what Cole decides to do next, in the face of impossible odds, is not just a choice, it is a reckoning. As the last grains of sand in Thorne's hourglass seemed to run out, a flicker of movement on the far ridge caught Cole's eye. It was not another of Thorne's men. It was a lone figure, trudging through the deep snow with a determined, steady gait. Cole squinted, his breath catching in his throat. It was Doc Miller. The old man was carrying his black medical bag, his face set in a mask of grim resolve. Thorne and his men had seen him too. One of the thugs stood up, raising his rifle. "That's far enough, old man." "Turn back," he yelled. Doc Miller didn't stop. He kept walking, his steps punching deep holes in the perfect white blanket of snow. "I have a patient in that cabin," the doctor called back, his voice surprisingly firm, carrying clearly in the cold air. "A sick child." "I'm a doctor." "You will not stop me from doing my duty." Thorne spurred his horse forward to intercept him, his face contorted in a sneer of disbelief and rage. "Your duty is to me, you old fool. I own your practice, I own your house. I own you." "You will turn around now." Doc Miller finally stopped, standing face to face with the tyrant who had terrorized him for years. The doctor's hands were trembling, but his eyes, for the first time in a long time, held no fear. They held a quiet, burning defiance. "No, Judge," he said, his voice level. "You own things. You don't own people." Not anymore. The sheer, unexpected courage of the old man was like a physical blow. Thorne was momentarily speechless. Inside the cabin, Cole watched, his heart pounding. He had been ready to die alone. He had not been prepared for an ally. Doc Miller's stand was more than just bravery, it was a signal. It was the first crack in Thorne's empire of fear. The doctor's defiance had bought them precious time, but more than that, it had planted a seed. Courage, it turned out, could be contagious. Elara, who had crept to the window beside Cole, let out a choked sob. It wasn't a sob of fear, but of a desperate, burgeoning hope. She looked from the brave old doctor to the unyielding man beside her. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt she was not alone in the fight. Cole met her gaze, and a silent understanding passed between them. The fight was no longer just his. It belonged to all of them. The standoff between Doc Miller and Judge Thorne was a tableau of good versus evil, a silent battle of wills played out in the snow. Thorne, seething with fury at this public insubordination, was about to give the order to his men when another movement caught everyone's attention. On the same ridge where the doctor had appeared, 3 more figures emerged from the tree line. They were townsfolk. A blacksmith named Jeb, his massive arms carrying a heavy buffalo rifle. A young farmer whose land bordered thorns, and his father. They weren't a posse. They weren't an army. They were just men who had been pushed too far, who had heard that Doc Miller was making a stand, and who had been inspired by Cole's impossible defiance. The sight of them, standing there silently, watching, was enough to change the entire dynamic. Thorne's power was built on the illusion of absolute control, on the belief that the people were too scared to ever unite against him. That illusion was now shattering before his eyes. "What is the meaning of this?" Thorne roared, his voice cracking with a hint of panic. "Go back to your homes. This doesn't concern you." The blacksmith, Jeb, took one step forward. His voice was a low growl that rumbled across the clearing. "It concerns us when a good man makes a stand against a snake, Judge. It concerns us when a sick child is used as a pawn. We're just here to see that things are done." Fairly, the word fairly was a direct challenge to Thorne's entire existence. His face turned a mottled shade of purple. His authority was evaporating in the cold mountain air. He was losing control, and it was driving him mad. He spun his horse to face the cabin, his eyes wild with desperation. "This is your fault," he screamed at Cole. "You and your whore. You'll all burn." He raised his pistol, no longer aiming at the cabin, but directly at Doc Miller. It was a coward's move, an act of spite from a man whose power was gone. But before he could pull the trigger, the impossible happened. Elara, who had been searching frantically through her son's belongings for a spare piece of cloth, let out a gasp. Tucked into the lining of the small, worn satchel her husband had given Leo was a hidden pocket. Her fingers, numb with cold and adrenaline, pulled out a small, folded piece of oilskin. She unwrapped it. It was the page from the ledger. Elias hadn't hidden it somewhere on the farm. He had hidden it with the one person he knew Thorne would never suspect, his own child. "Cole," she cried out, her voice filled with triumphant relief. "I have it! The proof! I have it right here!" That single cry, "I have it!" was the spark that ignited the powder keg. For Thorne, it was the death knell of his secrets, the final confirmation that his ruin was at hand. For Cole, it was the signal that the time for waiting was over. The time for justice had come. As Thorne swung his pistol away from the doctor and back toward the cabin, a shot rang out, not from Thorne's gun, but from Cole's Winchester. The sound cracked through the valley like a bolt of lightning. The bullet didn't hit Thorne. It hit the pistol in his hand, sending it spinning into the snow with a force that nearly broke his wrist. Thorne cried out in pain and shock, clutching his hand. In that same instant, Cole burst from the cabin door, his Colt peacemaker already in his hand, moving with a fluid grace that spoke of 1,000 deadly confrontations. He was no longer the hermit, the ghost. He was the lawman he had once been, reborn in fire and ice. One of Thorne's hired guns, recovering from the initial shock, raised his rifle towards Cole. From the ridge, the blacksmith's buffalo gun boomed, and the hired gun was thrown backwards into the snow, his threat neutralized. The second thug, seeing his partner fall and seeing the armed townsfolk on the ridge, lost his nerve completely. He threw down his weapon and raised his hands high in the air, his face a mask of pure terror. It was over in less than 10 seconds. The empire of Judge Thorne had crumbled into dust. Cole strode forward, his boots crunching in the snow, his pistol aimed steadily at Thorne's heart. The judge stared at him, his face a ruin of disbelief, rage, and fear. "It's over, Thorne," Cole said, his voice cold and steady as the grave. Doc Miller walked over and picked up the ledger page that Elara had dropped in the snow when the shooting started. He glanced at it, his eyes widening at the damning evidence of theft and conspiracy. He held it up. "It's all here," the doctor announced to the silent audience on the ridge. "Everything. The fraudulent debts. The stolen land. Elias's name is right here." Thorne, defeated and exposed, finally broke. He wasn't a mastermind or a king. He was just a greedy, pathetic man. He fell to his knees in the snow, a whimpering, broken thing. Justice hadn't come from a courtroom or a badge. It had come from the courage of a broken man, the love of a desperate mother, and the quiet solidarity of a community that had finally found its voice. The epilogue of Winter's End came with the spring thaw. Judge Thorne was gone, taken away by a federal marshal who, armed with a ledger page and the testimony of a dozen emboldened townsfolk, had no trouble securing a conviction. His empire of debt and fear was dismantled, the fraudulent deeds voided, and the land returned to its rightful owners. The town of Redemption Gulch began to breathe again, its people slowly learning to trust the rhythm of the seasons more than the whim of a powerful man. On the mountain, a different kind of thaw was taking place. Cole's cabin was no longer a tomb. Laughter, a sound he thought he'd never hear again, now echoed off its walls. Leo, healthy and strong, spent his days chasing butterflies in the meadow, his past terrors fading like morning mist. Elara, her face no longer etched with fear but softened by a quiet joy, had brought life back not only to the small garden she planted but to the heart of the man who had given them sanctuary. Cole had not become the boy's father in the way Elara had so desperately offered. Instead, he had become something more. He was a protector, a partner, a friend. He taught the boy how to track a deer and how to read the clouds. He worked alongside Elara, rebuilding the fences on her rightful land, the two of them falling into a comfortable rhythm of shared work and quiet understanding. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Elara reached out and placed her hand over his. Cole didn't pull away. His hand, calloused and scarred, remained steady under hers. For 5 years, his heart had been a frozen, barren landscape. Now, he could feel the first green shoots of a new life pushing through the frost. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that a man cannot truly heal his own wounds until he is willing to bandage the wounds of another. The story of Cole, Elara, and the fall of Judge Thorne became a quiet legend in the valley, a moral tale told around campfires. It was a story about how one single act of compassion, one man's refusal to step aside, can be enough to thaw the coldest winter and ignite the courage of a community. It taught that true strength isn't found in isolation and grief, but in the bonds we forge when we stand together against the darkness. If you were moved by Cole's journey from a haunted hermit to a reluctant hero, then subscribe to Wild West Stories for more tales of justice, redemption, and the untamed spirit of the frontier. And don't go anywhere. Click on the video you see on your screen now for another story that we promise is even more powerful. You won't want to miss it.